thank you, Dominic Grieve, for coming. It says you're the MP for Beaconsfield. Doesn't really do you justice now, I think, your fame. We've just heard from one of the self-proclaimed bad boys of Brexit, and I think you have become famous, of course, as really leading what's rather dashingly called the Rebel Alliance, and you put an enormous amount of effort into preventing, successfully so far, a no-deal Brexit, or perhaps even how we might stop Brexit altogether. But we've been sitting listening to Richard Tice, and I could sense your frustration with some of the things that he was saying. So maybe we could just start, if you'd like to respond to some of the main points he was making.
Well, there are a number of things which rather startled me. He said there were more people working in the City of London today than at the time of the referendum. Now, ultimately, you're reliant on figures you're given, so it's always possible I've got it wrong, but I think the City of London told me quite recently that 7,000 jobs had left the financial sector, and that is a loss of revenue to the UK government of about £1 billion. So I think that's rather a lot. That's one example of something he said. He also said, we may, funny enough, be in agreement that HS2 may not be value for money.
But I
have to say, the idea that there's suddenly going to be £100 billion from HS2 to inject into the UK economy, when I think it's a project that's likely to take about 20 years, that seems to me to be rather optimistic. So there are just two examples where I thought that Richard Tice's economic assessment of what's going to happen with Brexit seemed rather odd. I also have a lot of pharmaceutical industry in my constituency. I'm in the pharmaceutical arc that runs from London through to Bristol. A lot of those companies are seriously thinking of downsizing. They have their corporate headquarters. They often use it to operate in Europe, and they carry out research. They are all looking to as to their future. And interestingly, the one point I did agree with him, he said about services and distribution. Well, it's true. The warehousing industry has done incredibly well out of the last 12 months because my pharmaceutical companies have all been stockpiling medicines. I can assure you, when this is all over, there is going to be a crash in the warehouse market because it has expanded massively on the back of stockpiling.
OK, so maybe there's something you can agree with him on. And he said what we really need now is an early election. And, Parliament has prevented that happening twice so far. The government has a negative, is a minority by a wide margin, thanks to expelling MPs such as yourself. Do we need an early election now to sort this out?
I think there are two issues here. Firstly, Parliament has so far refused to sanction a general election because it will not do so until there is an extension to Article 50. And that makes perfect sense, because the government's original ploy on this was to try to crash us out either in the middle of the election campaign or so soon afterwards that it was over that the government wouldn't have a chance of being able to negotiate with the EU. That's clearly irresponsible. So getting the extension first is, to my mind, a priority. Thereafter, it may well be that we do have a general election. It all depends on what Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party ultimately want, and if they want to support the government on a fixed-term Parliament Act motion. But there are two reasons why that may not happen. The first one is that many Labour MPs think that Labour's position in going into this election is extremely weak, which it is, because they don't have a coherent policy on Brexit. And the second reason, which I would say against it, is I am concerned that whatever my fate might be in such an election, it's pretty irrelevant. I think that we may well find ourselves with a general election in the middle of December in exactly the same position. I disagree with Richard Tice on this. I think you may well end up, in fact, with another hung parliament and absolutely the same problem coming down the track of what are we going to do when we're about to crash out. And I believe very strongly that crashing out with no agreement is frankly catastrophic for this country. Therefore, my priority, first and foremost, is to prevent that from happening.
So I'm going to come back to the question of the election and what might happen, because everyone does agree, actually, that it's very difficult to predict. But on this question of the extension, today has been fairly significant. We've seen the government effectively admit, well, Number 10 is briefing everybody, that a deal is not going to happen. Now they're couching it in whatever terms you can interpret it as, that Mrs. Merkel has somehow said something to take it off the table. But the government have admitted pretty firmly they're not going to get an official deal. Now, your piece of legislation that you helped drive through the House of Commons, the Ben Act, is going to mandate the Prime Minister to ask for an extension. Richard Tice says that an extension is inevitable now. Do you agree? Is the Benn Act really going to do its job and force the Prime Minister to ask for that extension?
Yes, I think it will. I think it's fit for purpose. I think it does what it says on the ticket. All this froth about the government trying to find a way out of it, or defying it, or the Prime Minister somehow sitting in Downing Street and refusing to send this letter, these are all fantasy. And what's so astonishing about the current state of British governance is that in my lifetime, whilst we've had governments and oppositions, often at loggerheads, I've never experienced a situation where you get a government which is prepared to lie so serially as a matter of policy. On the whole, British governments have had standards they maintain, and therefore they're reticent about saying things which are palpably untrue. But we now have a government which appears to enjoy doing this and presumably thinks that because of the growth of social media, it will have an impact which will be to its propaganda advantage, although in the process it's slowly trashing the constitutional and institutional base of the country. Now, this is new, and frankly, I find it rather worrying.
Who do you hold? Who's to blame for this? Is it
the
Prime Minister
Johnson
himself,
it's the
or
Prime
is it
Minister.
his? You know, we all love to think about the dark arts of his advisor, Dominic Cummings, or is it?
Unless you want to decide that the Prime Minister is so inadequate that he is simply the hostage of Dominic Cummings, which I suppose you can make an analysis over, he is responsible for the way his government is conducted, including the lies it chooses to pump out via Mr. Cummings to the media, and including the statements that he's prepared to make, which suggest an anarchic approach to the way in which government should be carried out in this country, and a recklessness about what he might be willing to do to try to avoid a no-deal Brexit. Now, personally, I think all that is froth. He will ultimately have to write this letter. If he doesn't write the letter, the Cabinet Secretary and the Senior Civil Service will refuse to work for him. The Attorney General will resign. So I hope will the Lord Chancellor, and I hope actually most of the Cabinet. So he can then sit in Downing Street trying to govern with nobody to speak to. That could be quite interesting. It might even be salutary for him.
So, there's another way of looking at this, though, isn't there? And I think some of the commentary that I've seen this afternoon after that announcement from Downing Street around the conversation with Mrs. Merkel has been that, you know what, there's no doubt the EU was ever going to budge on this question, and because of the Benn Act. So the fact that no deal was taken off the table means the EU didn't have to give any ground at all, because they are betting on an extension and then another election, in which possibly some sort of Remain coalition. I mean, how do you respond to those criticisms?
I can understand the criticism, but my view is that this negotiation was never going anywhere anyway. Again, I listened to what Richard Tice was saying about Northern Ireland. I'm sorry, I just think it's astonishingly glib. I really wonder if he's been to the border. I wonder if he's spoken to people in Northern Ireland.
Have you been to the border?
Yes, I have. And I go to Northern Ireland quite frequently, and I've had an interest in Northern Ireland throughout all my time at Westminster. And we achieved peace in Northern Ireland, not without difficulty, and a completely changed relationship with Ireland, which has been to our mutual benefit. And there are serious issues in Northern Ireland about identity. And one of the things I find most remarkable and worrying about Brexiteers' attitudes is that actually they're not very concerned about the future of the United Kingdom. They're not very concerned about whether there would be a recurrence of violence in Northern Ireland and what you do to the identity issues that surround the border. It may be 1.5 smarties, but it's 1.5 smarties that matter very much to the people whose lives are affected by it. And the idea that we should be encouraging a greater smuggling industry that already exists along the Irish border is a rather startling statement. And anybody who speaks to the head of the PSNI will be told that these are really serious problems and go to criminality and gangsterism. Are we going to pursue policies that just say we don't care about those? It seems to me to be an absolute underlying characteristic. The other one that we get from Brexiteers, the other one's about Scotland. You cannot run a union where you utterly disregard the interests of what is undoubtedly a minority partner because of the size and their economic clout, but nevertheless a partner that's been with us since the early 18th century and for 100 years before that in a rather different relationship. This is an extraordinary way of conducting what I thought was the business of UK governments, which was to deliver quiet government, which we are certainly not doing.
We're certainly not doing that, no. Can I just talk a little bit more about what's going to happen in the next 2 weeks? Now, you said that the Benn Act is watertight. That it means an extension is granted. Let's just imagine that one of these cunning tricks does come to pass and the Prime Minister somehow wiggles out of his responsibility. Next week, Parliament is going to be suspended, prorogued in an unchallengeable way this time. We'll have a Queen's speech, quite a spectacle, that's going to be. And then we have the European Council. So when Parliament gets back on the 21st, that Monday, what do you and your fellow rebels, or the Rebel Alliance, do to try and prevent that no deal on the 31st?
Well, firstly, we're back on the 14th, so it's next Monday we're back. So it's very short prorogation. Then we have a Queen's speech. And then after the Queen's speech, we will have, we normally have the debate on the Queen's speech. But once Parliament has returned, the House of Commons is in a position, if it wishes, to take steps if the government is not doing what I think it should be doing. But my own view is that this letter is going to be written. In fact, I sometimes wonder if it might not be written earlier than we might expect. Because the government is going to have to write it.
So they could dash it off this afternoon and
well,
say, you know what?
They could.
Hands up, there's no deal.
They could do it earlier if they wanted to, yes. Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the real test for the House of Commons is what happens then. Because you asked me the question, and it's a very reasonable one. Logically, the likelihood is a general election. My view is that the better course of action would be to have our second referendum, because that would allow us to put to the public the three options and choices that are in fact available. And even though two of them I don't like, and one of them I think is awful of those two, nevertheless, I think it is our only way out, because otherwise we are in danger of just going round and round in circles again. I don't know how long the extension is going to be if we get it, but one thing's certain, we can't go on slowly chasing our tails and having the same sterile debate. I do accept we have to try to bring this to an end, but we cannot bring it to an end, and it will not happen by crashing out. And if the government continues to try to do that, there will continue to be resistance in the House of Commons, sufficient, I think, to stop them.
So if I'm getting this right, you're saying you're considering legislating for a second referendum, perhaps rather, throughout the extension period? Well, without an election?
There would be, my judgment is it would be much better to have that second referendum first, and then we can have a general election afterwards.
There's a majority in the House of Commons right now with this Parliament to do that?
There may be a general, I think there probably is a majority, but as long as Jeremy Corbyn will not sign up to it in terms of supporting a government of national unity of some form to deliver it, it will be impossible to deliver. Because you can't deliver a referendum unless you have a government that is prepared to do it. Now, I suppose it's just possible that Boris Johnson might change his mind and decide a referendum's a good option, but I wouldn't bank on it. If he was prepared to do that, whatever my views about him might be, I would support him to deliver that. I will not support him, and I will oppose him every inch of the way to take us over the cliff edge on no deal.
You raised this question of the government of national unity. It's not going to happen, is it? The idea that everyone can come together to legislate?
Yes, it can happen.
It happened once for the Ben Act, but if Mr Corbyn is going to insist on leading that, that's not going to fly, is it?
You're right. If Jeremy Corbyn insists on leading it, it can't happen, because ultimately you need a figure to lead it. It could be somebody from a number of different political parties, doesn't have to be from a particular one, who commands a high level of trust. Jeremy Corbyn's a very partisan politician. He's entitled to his views, but as a consequence, he doesn't command that level of trust. But it's possible it could happen, and admittedly, we would have to keep the referendum period very short.
What's the fastest we can get?
Well, I reckon, despite the fact the Electoral Commission tends to talk about 6 months, I think you can do it in three and a half. Okay. You need to be clear about what you want to do, and you need to carry it out. And certainly, the sooner the better. And you could then follow that with a general election immediately afterwards, which would allow us an opportunity to reset our politics, whatever the outcome may have been. Otherwise, we're just in danger, I think, of doing ourselves yet more damage as a country as we trash the institutions and we don't have any to replace them. OK,
let's just imagine we get the second referendum. And I think we've got a poll on this particular question here, so we can have our second referendum right now. But what's on the ballot paper is, first of all, my question. And secondly, what's the result?
As for what is on the ballot paper, my view has always been that you cannot keep no deal off the ballot paper. Okay. Now, I realise lots of people who want a referendum don't want it. But my judgment is that if you have a significant percentage of the population who seem to think this is a good idea, then however bad an idea I might think it to be, I think that to deny them that right, particularly in the light of the 2016 referendum result, would be wrong.
Certainly if it's government policy as well at that point.
Well, it is government policy, and I think the government would be entitled to put its policy to the public. Now, the deal, we don't have a deal from Boris Johnson. We do have a deal from Theresa May, although I have to say that opinion polling suggested it didn't command very much support. But certainly it would be proper to put it, and also it would be proper to put Remain, because people are in a democracy entitled to change their mind.
So this room is, perhaps unsurprisingly, slightly skewed towards the Remain vote. I think I know where at least one person has voted in the corner on the other side. Say we get that Remain vote then. Again, we're casting our minds far into the future here. That doesn't settle the question, though, does it?
No question in a democracy is ever settled. It's like saying Scottish independence was settled by the referendum in 2014. Of course it isn't. People are always entitled in a democracy to continue asking for something. But I do also think that experience suggests that if we were to vote to Remain and the government then reintegrates properly back into the European Union, seeks to influence its change, seeks to influence reform, which is undoubtedly needed, because I happen to be a mild Eurosceptic, far from being a sort of ultra-Europhile as I'm characterised. I'm perfectly conscious that the EU has stacks of flaws, but that's what happens with an international treaty organisation with 28 member states. But I happen to think that if we address those issues, we may well find that contrary to what some people might think, in 5-10 years' time, this issue has gone. The other thing I sometimes hear said is this is so divisive. If we were to have a second referendum, it would cause seismic collapse in the country of cohesion. I don't buy that. We're already under enormous... This is, to be truthful, although social media may be full of nutcases saying very unpleasant things, my experience of this very wearing debate we've had over the last 3 years is that most people are quite capable in this country of expressing themselves in moderate, democratic ways. And after all, if we have a general election immediately after this referendum and people don't like the result of the referendum, they can always elect a Brexit government to reverse it immediately if they wanted to do so. That is their right in a democracy. But personally, I don't think it will happen. And finally, as a historian, I always draw some reassurance from the fact that in the 17th century, we had a civil war, which actually killed a very large number of people. I mean, relative to the modern population, a huge number of people. But 10 years later, people used to refer to it as the late unpleasantness. And I think that the UK has rather good capacities for people living and let living. And we should be proud of that. And we need to try to resolve this current political problem in a sensible, democratic way. Crashing out with no deal is not that.
OK, let's just come back to this question of this election. When it comes, sooner or later, looking at the polls, have to say this strategy from number 10, the scaremongering, as you might call it, or the propaganda, seems to be working, doesn't it? The Conservative lead is widening. The Liberal Democrats aren't really having the breakthrough that some of us thought. So how do you interpret that? Aren't they winning the argument?
I have no doubt at all that the propaganda is quite effective in whipping up hatred of Parliament, the EU, or indeed anybody else, and therefore coalescing support from the hard Brexit vote around the Prime Minister. Whether that's sustainable is another matter, and what its electoral impact will be, I have some doubts. My own view, obviously you can only get impressions as an MP, so one has to be a bit careful about it, but I think the Conservative position in London, in the southeast and the southwest of England, is in an absolutely parlous state. If this government goes into an election saying that they believe in a no-deal Brexit, then all the, not only Remainer, but I actually think some of the soft leaver vote in the Conservative Party will look at this madness and depart. Now, I don't know. It may be, as Richard Tice was suggesting, you accumulate lots of votes in the Midlands and the North. You have to accumulate an awful lot of votes up there before you start winning Labour seats. So I would just be a little bit careful about, if I were the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister, about this tactic. It's very high risk. That said, my impression is that if the country is divided, ultimately those divisions will be reflected in the outcome of the election, which is why I've suggested that the real risk to us is we end up with another hung parliament and all the problems that go with it.
How much time are you putting into this question about a Remain alliance in your own seat of Beaconsfield? If there's an election when you still don't have the Conservative whip, reports about you having a deal with the Lib Dems to stand aside, we saw it in the Welsh by-election. Is that viable on a nationwide basis to form a Remain alliance in Parliament?
I have no idea. All I've done is to operate at my own local level. I've made clear that if there is an election before Brexit is resolved, because I think I won't be able to stand as a Conservative, either because I won't be allowed to, or the manifesto will be of a kind that I certainly can't support, I will stand as an independent. And the Liberal Democrats in my constituency and nationally have indicated that in those circumstances they won't put a candidate up. Now, I'm grateful for that, and it's, from my point of view, helpful. I don't think I would necessarily describe it as a deal, because ultimately it's a question of choice whether candidates want to stand in an election. But certainly I will do my best in that election to represent what I think is the moderate view about Brexit and remaining and having a referendum, which I want to put across. And the evidence suggests that I will also draw votes from people who voted Labour in 2017, but we got a curiously inflated Labour support in my constituency, much larger than usual, partly, I think, because of the Corbyn impact of him being different. And I think the evidence is pretty clear that there are a lot of Conservative voters who will vote for me as well. Whether that's enough to win the seat, which has historically been a very safe Conservative seat, I simply don't know. But I think my electorate are entitled to a choice. Now, looking more widely, it may be that there are other colleagues who will stand as independents who will be able to do similar things. But I don't think, ultimately, the public are going to have to make some difficult choices in this election. And it looks to me as if the election will polarise, if we have it before Brexit, very heavily round the issue of whether no deal is a viable future for our country or whether we should have some alternative way to resolve this. And I think that that will be the determining factor.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, Mrs May pitched her election 2.5 years ago as a Brexit election, and it didn't work out that way, right? And elections had this funny way of turning out to be about something that no one could predict. That one ended up being around care for the elderly, right? The so-called dementia tax. To what degree are we all in danger of falling into that trap again? We think this is going to be a single issue election. It could be about something else completely.
It could be, and that could well be a problem at the end anyway in terms of Brexit. But that said, I think there is a difference between now and 2017. I do think that in 2017, a lot of the electorate had simply brushed out of their mind the issue about how Brexit was going to be delivered. That was one of the problems we had from the original referendum. On both sides, there was, I think, a high degree of irresponsibility about what this actually entailed in terms of the revolutionary upheaval for our country. And so I think people were quite blithe about it. But we are now in 2019, approaching 2020, and I think we're going to find that people are much more focused, because unless you've really gone to sleep, I think it's a bit difficult to escape the fact that we are facing a national crisis which revolves around Brexit. So I can't be certain. I agree with you. People ultimately vote on a whole range of factors, and I'm sure that Brexit won't be the only one. But at the same time, looking at Westminster, looking at the government, and looking at the extent to which we appear to be paralysed and therefore incapable of doing anything, does seem to me to be quite a dominant theme. And so I would expect that people are going to be voting partly in accordance as to how they can see that being worked out and resolved.
And as you say, the problem is we may just roll the dice on this election and end up where we are before.
Well, that's a high risk.
That's a very high risk, right? What happens next after that?
I don't know. Ultimately, we will then be back to having exactly the same debate we're having now. Now, I don't know.
So you're here next year, right?
Well, and that raises a question as to what point the EU might run out of patience. But there are two alternative views on that. There's what I think is the Angela Merkel German view, that they will never throw a country out of the EU against its wishes. And I think that is rather very important to Germany. And then there are other views expressed by countries that are more frustrated by this. The French do it from time to time, which is we really can't go on like this. But actually, in a funny way, we can. I mean, Europe is still functioning. Admittedly, this is taking up some of the EU's time, and we are not fully participant members, so that we're losing out. And the uncertainty for business really does worry me. I accept that. But the trouble is, resolving uncertainty by plunging us into a deeper crisis is not an answer. And I mean, the other big issue is that whether we leave with a deal, admittedly that gives us a buffer period of now down to about a year, but whether it's a deal or no deal, we are going to be enmeshed in very difficult trade negotiations. And there again, I'm afraid Richard Tice was deliciously blithe about our leverage on over the European Union in negotiating an FTA when we have left, and we are in a position, I think, of ultimate weakness towards our EU partners. And I think this is going to be the dominant theme in the next 2.5, 3, 4 years of British governance if we leave. And what's the public going to make of this? The very people who you said in 2017 were beginning to be switched off the topic when they discover that they've been sold yet another pup by the government. Because the government's marketing of Brexit is, let's get it over with. We're not going to get it over with. It's
even if we've left,
even if we've left, we are going to be mired in it. It is going to be the dominant issue in our politics. Because there is a wider issue, which I think was highlighted by some of the things Richard Tice was saying. We can't escape it, and I can't escape it now as I listen to some of my Conservative colleagues. It's not just about leaving the EU. It's about a much bigger issue surrounding the long-term destiny of the United Kingdom as a nation. There is out there, and I can listen to what he's saying, I listen to my colleagues at Westminster, this vision that somehow we're about to morph into the Singapore of the Northeast Atlantic. I'm not sure how it quite squares with the 200 billion of squandering public money, but there's a belief that we're going to deregulate. We are going to have, I think, as a consequence, low taxes, which must mean, unless we suddenly get mega wealthy, that our welfare system is going to have to come under review. This is revolutionary stuff.
This is all in the future.
This is all in the future. But look at the changes that the government. The only other changes we know the government has been trying to get is to the future political declaration, where, contrary to Theresa May's model, which is we wish to be as closely aligned with you as possible, the government's new changes to the political declaration is we want to be aligned with you as little as possible. Now, there is an argument for that, because there is the vassalage element of being aligned when you don't have a say in the making of the rules. But the implication behind the parting company is that we are moving into a completely new style of economics and political destination. And what gets me and troubles me so much is I think this is something which is shared by a tiny percentage of the electorate. Most of the people who voted leave have not the slightest idea that this is the idea that is being put forward. They are tending to do it for actually rather protectionist reasons, for reasons of security control. And when they realise what's happening to them, it's the biggest invitation to go and vote for Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party that has ever been made to them, because the middle ground of British politics will have been entirely vacated. So there is actually an existential issue, both for the future of our country, because I don't think it'll hold together under such pressures, and actually for the future of the sort of country we want to be. And that's why, despite the fact I'm saddened by where I am in terms of my relations with my own party, I am absolutely determined that as long as there's a bit of life and breath in me, I'm going to continue this argument. If I lose it, so be it. But it's not an argument that any sensible politician should be willing to abdicate.
Dominic Grieve, we're out of time. Thank you very much.